What does it mean to invent not just a device, but an entirely new relationship between science, industry, and everyday life? In the second half of the 19th century, a largely self-taught experimenter from Ohio transformed himself into the architect of a model of innovation that still defines how technology is produced and commercialized. Tonight I'm here with Roland Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Edison is often reduced to the light bulb, and the famous line about genius being 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, but the real story is far more structural and far more consequential. Tonight, we turn to an inventor who understood that the invention of a technology and the invention of the system to deliver it were inseparable problems. The question is not what Edison invented, but what kind of world he was building when he invented it, and what that world has made of us.
Edison did not simply produce inventions, he produced industries. The light bulb, the phonograph, the motion picture camera, the electrical distribution system. Each of these was not merely a device, but the seed of an entirely new economic sector.
We are speaking about Thomas Edison and the structural rise of the modern technological and industrial world.
He was not the lone genius of popular mythology. He was the first person to industrialize the process of invention itself, turning creativity into a systematic, organized, and commercially oriented practice.
Then let us begin with the conditions that shaped Edison before he became Edison.
Thomas Edison was born in 1847 in Milan, Ohio, the seventh and youngest child of a Canadian father and a schoolteacher mother. His family moved to Port Huron, Michigan, when he was 7. He had very little formal schooling. His hearing deteriorated significantly during childhood, a condition he attributed to scarlet fever and a series of ear infections, though the precise cause remains uncertain. His mother taught him at home and allowed him to read widely and experiment freely. By the age of 12, he was selling newspapers and candy on the Grand Trunk Railway line between Port Huron and Detroit. He used his earnings to buy chemicals and equipment for experiments he conducted in a corner of the baggage car.
So he was running a small business and conducting scientific experiments simultaneously before he was a teenager.
Yes, and this combination, entrepreneurial instinct fused with experimental curiosity, never left it. But here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Edison is often portrayed as a self-made outsider who triumphed despite the system. In reality, the telegraph network of mid-19th century America gave him his first serious technical education and his first professional identity. At 15, he learned telegraphy from the father of a child whose life he had helped save on the railway. He spent the following years as an itinerant telegraph operator across the Midwest and the South, working night shifts that gave him time to read technical literature and experiment with telegraph equipment. He became an expert in the technology and began to think systematically about how to improve it.
So the telegraph system was his university.
Exactly, and it gave him something more than technical knowledge. It gave him a model of how technology creates infrastructure and how infrastructure creates economic value. The telegraph had transformed communication, finance, and journalism. Edison watched this and understood that the next transformative technology would do the same. He arrived in New York in 1869 with almost no money. Within days, he had repaired a broken stock ticker at the Gold Indicator Company during a crisis, impressing the management sufficiently to be hired on the spot. Within a year, he had sold his first significant invention, an improved stock ticker system, for $40,000.
So his entry into the professional world of invention was itself a demonstration of his method. Identify a failing system, fix it, and monetize the fix.
Precisely. Indeed. He used the capital from that sale to establish his first professional laboratory in Newark, New Jersey, and then in 1876 he built what became the most consequential facility of his career, and development laboratory at Menlo Park, New Jersey. Menlo Park was genuinely unprecedented. It was not a university laboratory, not a factory workshop, and not a private inventor's studio. It was a purpose-built facility staffed with machinists, chemists, mathematicians, and draftsmen, organized around the explicit goal of producing inventions on a regular schedule. Edison described his ambition as producing a minor invention every 10 days, and a major invention every 6 months.
So he was industrializing invention itself, treating creativity as a production problem.
Yes, and this is the turning point in his story and in the history of technology. Before Menlo Park, invention was largely an individual or small-scale activity. After Menlo Park, the model of the organized research laboratory became the template for how corporations, universities, and governments would approach technological development throughout the 20th century. The phonograph, invented in 1877, was the product that established his international reputation. It was a device that had no obvious precedent and no existing market. The idea of recording and playing back the human voice struck contemporaries as almost magical. Edison himself was not immediately certain what the device was for. He listed possible applications including dictation, audiobooks for the blind, and the preservation of the voices of dying family members.
So he invented the phonograph without fully knowing what problem it solved.
Exactly. The market for recorded music was not something Edison envisioned clearly. That use emerged later, driven by others. This is a recurring pattern in his work. He created the technical possibility, and the social and commercial meaning of the invention was then worked out by the broader economy. The light bulb project, which occupied Menlo Park from 1878 to 1879, is the most instructive example of his method. Edison did not invent the concept of electric light. Multiple inventors had produced arc lights and incandescent bulbs before him. What Edison invented was a practical, long-lasting, economically viable incandescent bulb that could function within a complete electrical distribution system.
So, the invention was not the bulb, but the system.
Precisely. Edison understood from the beginning that a light bulb was useless without a way to deliver electricity to it reliably and cheaply. He worked simultaneously on the bulb, the generator, the distribution network, the meters, and the wiring infrastructure. In 1882, he opened the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan, the world's first commercial electrical power station, and lit a section of the city. The War of Currents, which developed in the late 1880s, is the most dramatic episode in his later career. Edison had built his entire system around direct current. Nikola Tesla, working with George Westinghouse, proposed alternating current as the standard for electrical distribution. Alternating current could be transmitted over much longer distances at lower cost, a significant practical advantage.
So the War of Currents was not simply a technical dispute, it was a contest over whose infrastructure would define the future.
Yes, and Edison's response to the threat is one of the more troubling episodes in his biography. He organized public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted with alternating current to argue that it was too dangerous for domestic use. He lobbied against the adoption of alternating current with considerable vigor. He lost. By the 1890s, alternating current had become the standard econ.
So his willingness to use theater and spectacle to defend a commercial position eventually cost him the argument.
Exactly. And this episode illustrates a dimension of Edison that is essential to understanding him accurately. He was not simply a servant of technological progress. He was a businessman with substantial financial interests in specific technical standards. His public persona as the Wizard of Menlo Park was itself a carefully managed brand, used to attract investment and to shape public opinion on matters directly connected to his commercial interests. His use of patents was equally aggressive. Edison accumulated over 1,000 patents during his career. He used patent control not only to protect his own inventions but to exclude competitors, to extract licensing fees, and to consolidate market position. The motion picture industry of the early 20th century was shaped in part by his attempt to control film technology through a patent pool that restricted who could make and distribute films.
So patents were as much a competitive weapon as a protection for creativity.
Yes, and independent filmmakers who wanted to work outside his control eventually relocated to Southern California, partly to be far enough from his New Jersey base to evade enforcement. Hollywood's geography is in part a consequence of Edison's patent politics. Edison passed away in 1931 at the age of 84. By then the world he had helped build was fully in place. Electrified cities, recorded sound, motion pictures, and industrial research laboratories were no longer novelties, but the foundations of modern life. He had lived long enough to see the industries he created become larger than any single inventor could control. The context of the Second Industrial Revolution is essential for understanding why Edison's approach succeeded when and where it did. The 1870s and 80s in the United States were a period of rapid industrial expansion, railroad consolidation, and the emergence of large corporations capable of financing and deploying technology at national scale. Edison's genius was partly in recognizing that this environment rewarded the systematic production of commercially viable inventions over the individual discovery of scientific principles.
So he shaped his method to the economic moment he was living in.
Exactly. He was not interested in pure science. He explicitly distinguished between what he called the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake and the development of knowledge for practical application. This was not anti-intellectualism. It was a deliberate strategic choice about where to direct his energy in a world that was structurally organized to reward commercial innovation. His media strategy was as deliberate as his technical strategy. He cultivated relationships with journalists and gave access to newspapers in ways that created a steady stream of favorable coverage. The image of the Wizard of Menlo Park working through the night, surviving on catnaps and cigars, was partly real and partly constructed. He understood that public attention was itself a form of capital that could attract investors and influence regulators.
So he was managing a public narrative at the same time he was managing a laboratory.
Yes. Edison replaced that image with something closer to what we would now call a technology entrepreneur, a figure who moved fluidly between the laboratory, the boardroom, and the press conference. The motion picture work he undertook in the early 1890s produced the kinetoscope, a device for individual viewing of short films, and later the vetoscope, which projected films for audiences. These were among the earliest moving picture technologies to reach commercial deployment in the United States. His laboratory assistant, William Dixon, did much of the technical development work, a fact that Edison was not always punctilious in acknowledging.
So the question of attribution within Menlo Park is itself complicated.
Yes, this is one of the tensions that runs through his biography. The industrial laboratory model he created was extraordinarily productive, but it also meant that the contributions of the many skilled workers he employed were subsumed under his name and his patents. The people who worked at Menlo Park were well paid by the standards of the era, but their intellectual contributions were legally the property of the laboratory and its principal.
So the factory model of invention had the same asymmetry of ownership as the factory model of production.
Precisely, and this asymmetry was not accidental. It was built into the legal and organizational structure of the enterprise from the beginning. Edison was acutely aware that the value of the laboratory depended on clear ownership of its outputs, and he structured his arrangements with employees accordingly. The romantic image of collaborative invention at Menlo Park coexisted with a rigorous corporate logic about who owned what.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand how Edison built not just inventions but industries, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Edison by Edmund Morris.
So this is a biography that takes seriously both the inventor and the industrial strategist behind the public myth.
Morris presents a comprehensive and nuanced portrait of Edison, tracing his journey from a largely self-educated youth to one of the most influential inventors of the modern age. The book explores not only his technological achievements but also his role in shaping industrial research, corporate innovation, and the electrification of modern society, situating him within the broader transformation of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Is it accessible to readers without a technical background?
Morris was primarily a biographer, rather than a historian of technology, which means the book reads as a narrative of a life, rather than a technical survey. The science is present, but never allowed to overwhelm the human story. A general reader will find it engaging and clear.
So it gives the reader not only Edison the inventor, but Edison the strategist, the brand, and the institution.
Precisely, and Morris does not shy away from the contradictions. The book is honest about the patent wars, the animal demonstrations, and the limits of Edison's vision in the later years of his career.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of Edison's work was visible within his own lifetime. The electrical industry he helped create became one of the largest sectors of the global economy, within 2 decades of the opening of Pearl Street Station. General Electric, formed partly from the consolidation of Edison's electrical companies, became one of the defining corporations of the 20th century, but the deeper legacy was institutional, rather than technological. The model of the industrial research laboratory that Edison pioneered at Menlo Park was adopted by AT&T, DuPont, General Electric, and eventually by the major universities and government agencies that shaped 20th century science.
So the most consequential thing he invented was not a device, but a method.
Exactly, and this method had consequences that extended beyond the laboratory. By transforming invention into a professional and corporate activity, Edison also changed who got to invent, under what conditions, and for whose benefit. The individual experimenter working alone was not eliminated, but the center of gravity in technological development shifted toward organized teams, institutional funding, and corporate ownership of results. The complications of his legacy are considerable. Edison's aggressive patent strategy contributed to the development of intellectual property law as a major force in commercial competition. The industries he helped create also created new forms of dependency. The electrification of cities required centralized infrastructure that gave significant power to those who controlled it. The recorded music industry he helped initiate eventually concentrated control over cultural production in ways that continue to be contested.
So the systems he built created new concentrations of power, even as they distributed new capabilities.
Yes, and this tension is built into the structure of technological systems generally. A technology that solves a problem at scale requires infrastructure, and infrastructure requires control. Edison understood this better than almost anyone of his era, which is part of why he fought so hard over standards and patents. He was not only an inventor, he was a builder of systems, and systems have politics. His enduring relevance is structural rather than sentimental. The questions his career raises are the questions that define technological development today. Who owns the infrastructure? Who controls the standards? How is the value of invention distributed between the individual who produces it and the institution that funds and deploys it? These are not questions that have been resolved since Edison's time. They have only grown more pressing.
So Edison is not a figure from the past, but a template that is still running.
Precisely. The Silicon Valley model of the technology startup, the industrial research campus, the aggressive patent portfolio, the carefully managed public persona of the inventor as visionary, all of these are recognizable. Descendants of what Edison built in New Jersey in the 1870s and 80s. The form has changed, the logic has not. What changes between Edison's era and our own is the scale and the speed. Edison built systems that took decades to mature. The technologies of the digital age mature in years or months. But the underlying dynamic, motion.
So understanding Edison is not nostalgia, it is diagnosis.
Yes, and that diagnosis requires seeing him clearly, not as the myth of the lone genius triumphing through persistence, but as a strategist who understood the relationship between technical innovation and economic power more deeply than almost anyone of his time, and who used that understanding to build something that outlasted him by more than a century.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the invention of invention itself, the electrification of the modern world, and the systems of power that Edison built and that still shape us.
Edison reminds us that the most transformative act is not producing a new device, but producing a new relationship between knowledge, capital, and the infrastructure of daily life.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.